Hello, my name is Nancy Price, and I'm co-chair of the Alliance for Democracy. We try to explain to our members and to the community at large the issue of corporate rights versus the rights of people. This is a crucial subject because corporations are more and more coming to dominate our politics, our economics, our media, our healthcare, our education, our society in many ways, so that, in fact, much of what we, the public, would like to see take place to serve public needs is beginning to be taken over by corporations making decisions about what we, citizens, and we, the public, need. One of our projects under the globalization campaign is a project on water. Now, I don't know how many of you really think seriously when you open your tap and turn it on and that water comes rushing out. Very much about where that water comes from, whether your water is delivered to you by a public service or a private corporation, and whether that water is really clean and healthy for you to drink. I don't know how many of you realize that 85% or more of our water delivery systems in the United States are still public. But these public systems are under attack. As they're under attack in many of the countries of the developing world, and as they have been attacked and taken over in many first world countries. The way that public systems have become privatized, that is, public systems that are water service systems that deliver public water to our homes, and public wastewater systems have become privatized, are two ways generally. One is in the developing country, through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they have had policies which have dictated to the developing countries that if they would like loans to help these developing countries and their governments, improve services and improve domestic production for export, and they need loans to do that, that to get those loans, they must privatize their public services. So in many cases, in countries like Bolivia and Peru and Argentina and the Philippines and many countries in Africa, to name just a few, these countries have been requested to privatize their educational system, their transportation system, their public water system, in order to get these loans. And in part because the IMF and the World Bank have made the claims that these public systems are inefficient and don't deliver a public service in a cost-effective manner. So they're forced to privatize these systems, which means to sell these systems off to a private corporation that then owns and runs the system. Now, in the United States, the privatization of our water services and water sewage treatment systems is happening in a somewhat different way, a different means, but actually is having the same effect. The fact that our infrastructure in America is in great need of repair and maintenance means that many municipalities don't really have the funds to deliver public water in a cost-effective way, because there needs to be so much either repair or maintenance or extension of service to underserved neighborhoods, and that is expensive. That uses tax dollars. And many municipalities don't have that income right now because, in fact, the federal government and state governments have cut back on helping municipalities. A lot of our tax dollars are really going to fund adventures that we might not fund if we had our choice. For example, the billions and billions of dollars going to the war in Iraq takes billions and billions of dollars out of monies that might be put to repairing our public services and our public infrastructure in the United States. So because many of the municipalities cannot repair their public system, it's easy to say, well, we'll turn that over to a private system. They can do it. And the private systems often say we can do it for less cost, we can deliver water for less cost, we can do the repairs and maintenance for less cost. And most municipalities that have done this have found that's not been true. For example, in Atlanta, they didn't sell the system outright, because in America often it's not that the system is sold outright, but the management and the running of the system is contracted out to a private corporation on a 20 or 30-year contract. And the private corporation says, well, we can do that cheaply, we can provide good water. And what happened in Atlanta, costs went up, rates went up, public service workers were fired, the quality of water went down, there were so many boil water days, and so many days when they were flushing out the pipes that the water coming through the tap was brown, that in fact Atlanta, the citizens of Atlanta have finally revolted, and they broke their contract with this private corporation and have virtually taken back their system, the contracting out of the system, and regained the public management of their system. The reason this is important is that when the public, when local government and public officials are running the public system, there's transparency, you know about the costs, there's a public record of costs, you know there's public accountability. You can turn to somebody and say, this water is inadequate, this water is coming through brown, this water is in fact contaminated, and you can have a public official then held responsible, and you can get that fixed. There are many municipalities now that are facing situations, particularly in Detroit, where in fact rates are either going sky high, in New Orleans, in Stockton, California, in Sacramento, California, or where in fact water is being turned off to homes because ratepayers can't pay and therefore don't have access. In America now, there's beginning to be more and more evidence that privatization, either through outright purchase or contracts to manage water, is really not the way to go. And you'll be hearing more and more, I think, on this program and in the newspaper about these, what we call water grabs, and how people are fighting back. Now, the issue of public water service is not the only issue. There's another issue, which is the trade that is beginning to develop in bulk fresh water. I live in California, so let me just tell you about a somewhat outlandish scheme that was really proposed, which was a man named Rick Davich, who owned Alaska Export Water, and his scheme was to be given permits to take the so-called excess water from 2 rivers in Northern California, collect that water in polyfiber bags, each 2 football fields in length, and tow those bags to Southern California to sell that water to the municipality of San Diego. The environmentalists organized, and Alliance for Democracy chapter members in Northern California organized to prevent him from getting these permits from the State Water Resources Control Board. And as outlandish as the scheme may seem, in fact, in the Mediterranean, water is being carried in this bag system, being towed between Turkey and Cyprus in the Mediterranean. It's a concept and a technology of bulk water transport that is actually being further developed and is being touted as the way to get bulk fresh water from countries and locales where we still have good freshwater resources to countries and locations that are suffering from water shortage. Now, in California, as I think maybe Minnesota, but there are a number of states in the United States that are very strong public trust water states, where it is stated in the Constitution and in water law that the state holds in trust for the people the waters of the state as public trust waters. Therefore, in California, we challenge this permitting of the so-called excess river water as a challenge to the state, should they give those permits, to actually giving away public trust waters to this corporation. Now, what makes this a problem is that even though this corporation was in Alaska, therefore an American corporation, should this man, Mr. Davich, CEO of Alaska Water Exports, create a subsidiary that was chartered in either Canada or Mexico, he could come back in under the NAFTA, under the North American Free Trade Agreement, and make claims. Should it be found that the quantity of water he was taking needed to be reduced because the environment was being harmed, he could then make a NAFTA claim that his profits were being damaged. Not that the environment was being damaged, but that his profits were being damaged. And therefore, he might go to the NAFTA tribunal and ask that his claim to future profits be awarded to him as a damage claim that could be in the multi-millions of dollars. I don't know how many of you in Minnesota know that in California, our Governor Gray Davis banned the gasoline additive MTBE that was used to oxygenate gasoline better and produce cleaner air to meet the clean air standards. But that additive, MTBE, has actually always been known to be carcinogenic and highly water soluble. And so it's contaminated a large percent of water in California. And the ban was put in place to, of course, stop that from happening. And the Canadian corporation that makes the M, just the M of MTBE, went to the NAFTA trade court and has a $970 million claim in the NAFTA trade court against the U.S. government for the ban of the state of California of this additive. So I'm using this example as a way of demonstrating that even though Alaska Export Water at this time, when he was seeking the permits, was an American corporation, that had he created a Canadian or Mexican subsidy, he could come back in under NAFTA and make a claim, seek an award, and if the environmental law that was seeking to reduce the amount of water he was taking, he felt was damaging his profits, either the law would have to be done away with or the damages paid. And who pays those damages? It comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. So the trade in bulk water resources is something that we have to keep our eye on. In fact, there is a California corporation called Sunbelt Water Incorporated that had permits. They were negotiating with the Canadian province, the British Columbian province. And the British Columbian government finally came to their senses and said, no, we don't think we're going to trade in bulk fresh water. We're not going to provide these permits to Sunbelt Water. And Sunbelt Water now has, in the NAFTA trade court against Canada, a $10 billion claim for future lost profits. This is how extreme corporate claims over our public waters can become, and how the trade agreements can protect corporations and not protect the public. Let me just say something about the trade agreements. Alaska Export Water could be doing business in California and could actually get lease to the water and could be subject to California law in various ways. But under the trade agreements, this corporation not only gets permit to the water and a 20 or 30-year permit, but then the trade agreements sit on top of whatever he's allowed under their permits and provides him extra protection, provides him the ability to come back in and claim lost profits. It allows him to come back in and say that any kinds of laws or regulations that might protect the environment or public health are burdensome and have to be shown to be no less burdensome than necessary. And the fact that he could get a permit to take that bulk water under specified conditions means that any other domestic or any other foreign corporation would have to be given the same permit, the same quantity, and given the same conditions. Now let me just speak a minute about another way that bulk water is being taken from the public, and that's through the bottled water industry. Throughout the United States, in particular, the Nestle, the giant Swiss food corporation Nestle, through their subsidiary Perrier, has bought up many of the local bottled water corporations and still sells that bottled water under local names. And they're buying up other springs now and searching out other springs to purchase. And it's by gaining permit to local springs and bottling that water, putting that bottled water on the market, they virtually get access to the spring water for pennies. And they sell the bottled water for more than $1. And most of that is profit. And what happens when they draw down these springs is they damage the surrounding ecology. They come in and they claim that building a bottling plant near the spring will create jobs and will bring economic development to a community. Most often they don't hire within the local community. And in fact, the economic development is really quite superficial and in fact can be transitory, because what if that bottled water company decides to leave that community after that spring goes dry or doesn't produce as much water as they expect? In fact, local communities should really do an inventory of local skills, local needs, local talents, and the people of these communities come together and say, what do we want for economic development? We don't have to rely on outside promises and outside businesses coming in, that in fact there's enough talent to figure out how to provide for the community in a sustainable and environmentally conscious way that will provide over the long haul. In fact, these bottled water companies, in making those claims of local development, actually bring a great deal of cost to the community. You know, when you walk into your kitchen and turn on the water, don't take for granted that that water is going to flow so easily. You have to remember that we're in a time of growing scarcity. We're in a time of scarcity because of increased population needs, weather patterns are changing, global warming, and continued contamination of water resources, so that corporations are beginning to understand that water is, as Maud Barlow, a world-renowned speaker about water problems, has said, that we're in the 21st century where water is blue gold, that it's the next market for corporations to corner and capture for profit. And we have to think seriously about this, because after all, water is the very substance and the very basis of life. I think that more and more we are faced with considering what it is that as citizens in a democracy we have a right to claim and we have a right to demand, and that is that our local, our state, and our federal government work for us and don't protect corporations and corporate profits over the public good and the public welfare. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Marie Mason and I work with the Sweetwater Alliance. I've been a community, peace, social justice, and environmental activist for some 20-odd years and have built up connections to a lot of those movements in my area and also around the world. One of the reasons that I am now part of a water warrior network that is working on the issue of water privatization is that a place that's near and dear to me, a place up in mid-Michigan, became under threat from an international corporation that had been snooping around the world looking for the weakest legislation that they could find protecting groundwater, and they found it in Michigan. Under Governor Engler, he had basically put out the welcome mat for corporations to come in, cut a deal, and do what they could to trade off on our natural resources for corporate profit. And unfortunately, little Stanwood, Michigan was sitting on a wonderful aquifer of pure water that fed many, many streams and rivers in the area, wetlands, and basically created the underpinnings for a beautiful natural area that was home to an Amish community, a retired community, some small family farmers, and certainly people who did not suspect at all that an international corporation was watching them with great interest. Perrier Corporation and its subsidiary Ice Mountain, which is the name of the water brand that eventually was the name of the corporation that took over the pumping there, had discovered that in Michigan, groundwater is hardly mapped, let alone protected by legislation. And for the price of $85, a pumping permit, a one-time cost, they were able to get access to this aquifer.
Groundwater is the purest water in this basin. These aquifers were formed by ancient glaciers. Only a little bit of it is recharged by rainwater. It's a non-renewable resource, at least until the next ice age.
Originally, their plan was to pump 800 gallons per minute out of the area, and as soon as that plan became public, several environmental groups, Native American tribes, local community activists balked at the idea of so much water leaving so fast, and certainly without any local democratic input into this decision at all. Immediately there was a court order restraining them to half of that amount, 400 gallons per minute. But even so, it is a devastating amount of water to take from an aquifer, which is, according to all of our information from biologists and geologists, a negligibly rechargeable aquifer. And that means basically that over a 100-year period, that aquifer does not replenish itself from the cycles of rain and runoff and streams that are in the area. That aquifer feeds into the Little Manistee River. The Little Manistee River feeds into Lake Michigan and is certainly part of the whole system of lakes that form the Great Lakes Basin.
Half the people in Michigan depend upon this groundwater for their daily drinking water supply.
Because of that fact, a local group, the Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation, launched a lawsuit saying that this had an effect of water diversion. Now, water diversion is supposed to be controlled under a charter between the United States and Canada, and therefore no decision concerning that water diversion should happen without signing off on each of those decision-making bodies, and that would be about 5 states, and we had originally thought the Native American tribes that were involved. Upon going to court, the tribe's sovereignty was immediately dismissed, and much to their chagrin, they were dismissed from the case. Not having the resources to pursue it further, they have bowed out of the legal strategy, but continue to work closely with us on public organizing and education. We have done many tactics and strategies in this fight to prevent the privatization of water in Michigan.
The real test of democracy, the real test of whether or not democracy can work, will center around, will we as people have the right to protect our water and to protect our land and to protect the birthright of our children?
We now have a lawsuit. MCWC and plaintiffs have filed a lawsuit here in Mecosta County. And the easiest way I can explain what our lawsuit is whose water is it? And I'm asking you, whose water is it?
Unfortunately, those strategies have merely slowed down the process of this corporation, Ice Mountain. Ice Mountain now has 2 more test sites out of the 37 identified sites around Michigan that they would like to develop. We feel that if we were not giving them so much trouble in the courts, in the streets, in the communities, shining a very bright light on what they're doing, that they would have developed these sites much more quickly. In the process, and it's been about 3 years that we have been fighting Perrier and Ice Mountain in Stanwood, we have also become aware of another threat against water in Michigan, and this has to do with privatization of municipal water systems. There's a handful of corporations, international corporations, operating around the world, much in the same way that Perrier sniffed out a vulnerable situation. These corporations are also looking for aged municipal water systems, systems that are in disrepair because they have lacked sufficient local money, subsidies, government funds to keep up with growing populations. These corporations send people out all over the world to find these places where municipal water systems are in desperate need of repair, are generally in communities that are very poor, generally in communities that are communities of color. They are looking for a sacrificed community that's been written off by their local government, and they sense that if they can move in and privatize it, that there's profit to be made. In our lower part of our state, in Detroit and in Highland Park, there are 2 separate water systems. The city of Highland Park is in state receivership because of a situation where they have gone bankrupt. They're not allowed to legally file for bankruptcy, which would actually allow them a way of more humanely doing debt restructuring, but they have been placed into state receivership. And so a private entity, which is not a locally democratically elected group of officials, is in charge of deciding what happens with Highland Park, with their water system and with their other public systems. And what has happened is one of these people, Jan Lazar, is an employee of a group called the Mercer Group. They are a consulting firm, they are pro-privatization, and very often Jan Lazar and other members of this group go into cities that are experiencing huge trauma because of debt and basically open the door for privatization given their vulnerable status. And Jan Lazar, true to form, has invited private corporations to come in to Highland Park and, first off, privatizing one segment of their water system. The billing, collections, and shutoffs have been privatized to a group in Alpena, and because of this, it opens the door for the entire system to be privatized. Once you privatize one part of a system, any outside international corporation can come in and say, well, part of it's already been privatized, so there's no protection for the rest of your municipal system. And this is the fight that we are having in Highland Park. We have been able to mobilize a powerful coalition of residents with the Highland Park Human Rights Coalition, also a group of people, the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, which works both locally and nationally on issues of welfare rights. They have also joined the coalition. We have Detroiters working for environmental justice. They have also joined the coalition, along with Sweetwater Alliance, to try and call attention, first of all, and do as much public education as we can, but secondly, try and put a stop to this railroad that is happening of picking up speed, of more and more pieces of the system being divvied up and parceled out to private corporations. At the same time as we have this fight going on, we are also working in Detroit. Detroit is a much larger system, servicing 273 communities. This system has been handed over to Victor Mercado. Victor Mercado is a former employee of United Waters in Puerto Rico, where they privatized that municipal water system. He was headhunted by our mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, who had received a memo that had gone out to all the mayors in the United States, encouraging them to consider privatization to be a solution to a water system that is not operating at a profit. Very interested in this, Kwame Kilpatrick basically looked for someone who would make this privatization process happen, and he brought in Victor Mercado at a cost of $200,000 a year in salary. Victor Mercado has already made several steps towards this privatization process and has very openly said that he wants to run the water department at a profit, not as a public service, but under a more corporate mentality. He has, in light of that, caused over 40,000 addresses to be shut off from access to water. This is such a monstrous number that it is very difficult to convey what effect that might have on a struggling city. Detroit is definitely part of the Rust Belt. We see every year more manufacturing concerns leaving the area, more thousands of jobs being lost. And as people are making the adjustment from being employed to looking for employment, or looking for employment that does not pay at the same rate as their former union employment did, we are seeing many more families struggling to both put food on the table, pay the house note, and also have water and lights and gas. And in Detroit, we have reached such a crisis that we have families who have left their homes, fled, because they cannot pay their utilities, they cannot stay warm in the winter. We had 2 seniors who passed away because their access to water was cut off. And so, without any idea of how they could go about getting access to water, they perished. One thing that may not be immediately apparent is that in Detroit, if you don't have access to water, many areas are steam heated still under old systems. If you do not have access to water, you do not have access to heat. And in temperatures that often dip well below freezing in these months heading into November and December, you're looking at an unlivable situation. And we are looking sadly forward to hearing about more families that have perished. We've had situations where families were unaware that the water was actually cut off and not just frozen because they had lost their heat. We had one family that set a small fire underneath a pipe trying to warm it up, thinking that it was frozen. And as the protective wrapping around that pipe, asbestos and other things to insulate it, caught fire. The house caught fire. And the mother and the father and the 3 children were dead before the fire trucks were able to get to their residence. So we have a situation where being poor in Detroit has become a death sentence.
take it no more. Can't take it no more. Can't take it no more.
People do a lot of things to keep warm. They're desperate. They build fires. Then you hear about children dying. And we wonder, oh, it's sad, the house caught fire and the children died. Well, if the utilities was turned on, the house wouldn't have caught fire. The kids wouldn't have died. You hear about senior citizens freezing to death in their house. And you go, oh, that's sad. How did that happen? Well, if you have no utilities, they freeze to death.
Since there are such high numbers of individuals, we're talking children, we're talking seniors, that don't have access to water, what kind of people are we that we would allow for services to be cut off? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what it is you need to do. And all of us, we've been on the picket line in front of the water department demanding that they restore services to the homes of the poor. Mary Jones is a senior citizen. Her water is either off or about to be cut off. And we're in the house that's next door to it where the water is running now. We can hear the water. There's a wall of ice behind me. She says it's been this way since September. We can hear the water, and here's the dead cat laying in the ground, frozen in its tracks. Just amazing. You can't make this stuff up.
Why is it like this?
Because nobody cares. It's running, Ms. Jones says that it's been running since September of 2002. And nobody's interested to come and turn the water off. And so her bill is higher because of that. And it's going to go on just like this. And then we got people that can't get water in their houses. It just doesn't make any kind of damn sense. Here's Exhibit A. You can't make this stuff up.
My husband was a barber here in this shop. His chair is the first chair at the door there. And we've been here, like I say, since 1985. A lot of businesses around here are like small, like family businesses, and they're really suffering. We had to close because of the escalating water bills, and by the fact that the city had come and they had turned off the water at this location. From 70 to 85, I considered us to be middle-class people, but now we're poor people. We're poor people now. I can't afford to pay $1,200 a year for water. I just hate to see this happen, you know, to Highland Park. I hate to see this happen to Johnson's Hair Care Center. Simply because it belonged to my husband. Yep. People should never ever have to steal water to survive, because I feel that water is a human right. We have really come to the era of the have and have-nots. It's here right now. People can't live a decent life. I'm not talking about a real good, fabulous life. I'm just talking about something decent, where all of us can have water, where we can have gas, electricity. Well, we can't do that. And I also feel that eventually the control of water will be global. And whoever controls the water will control the world.
This is not the society that we want to live in. This is not the society that we want to build. As grassroots activists building coalitions across the board, we are trying to bring together people who see this issue both from its environmental, detrimental aspects. I mean, certainly when people cannot have water in their homes and they're forced to go buy bottled water, and the bottled water is in plastic bottles, we have landfills that are overflowing with mostly plastic containers. And you have a human rights issue where people are dying because of not having access to this basic ingredient of life. Then you have the beginnings of an understanding as a movement that we cannot allow a system of society and government to continue that places profit and corporate rights over human rights. And so we're hoping that as I'm talking to you through this cable station, I'm hoping that you in your home, in your community, will realize that this is something that's coming to your town and that you need to take action, because there is nothing between you and the corporations except you and your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor, and working together to protect ourselves and our democratic rights and our human rights and the environment that we all live in and share. We must work together to turn back this tide. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that we'll be working together on the water movement.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Darcie Rowe, and I am the founder of a local citizens coalition called the Minnesota Water Alliance. I want to share with you what is occurring in the state of Minnesota. But first, let's look back at some of what we have heard so far. Nancy Price from the Alliance for Democracy spoke to us about the global trend toward privatizing water resources. Water is growing more scarce, and many are seeking to position themselves to profit from water resources. This privatization of water resources occurs in a number of ways. Water bottling companies purchase land, and they purchase it over springs or water aquifers and pump for profit. They give little regard to the impacts their water pumping has on local environments. Water exporters seek to transport water from one area of the globe to the next. In Minnesota, our cherished Lake Superior needs protection from water exporters. Another form of privatization occurring is the private takeover of public water services. Marie Mason from Sweetwater Alliance was able to demonstrate for us the negative impacts that occur when a public water system becomes privately operated. Sweetwater is working hard in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit's water delivery services are privatized. A public service is directly accountable to the city and the public they serve, but private operators are accountable to their corporate boards and the profits of the company. In a private system, if you cannot pay, then you do not receive services. It is estimated that 50,000 households face water shutoffs in Detroit this winter. There were approximately 18 deaths in Detroit last winter that are being attributed to the water shutoffs. Water privatization efforts continue on many fronts throughout the United States. The state of Minnesota is not immune to water privatization. The Minnesota Water Alliance has made it our mission to protect and defend our right to water by advocating for equitable and sustainable water policies that place water management firmly in the public domain. We believe that the conditions are right for privatization of water services to emerge in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We believe this because local conditions are strongly mirroring the climates in which privatization has occurred in other communities. For example, we are older communities, and our water management systems have been around for a long time. Population growth in and around the metro region continues to place increased stress on this aging system. And we are facing a huge deficit, and our state government has limited means to maintain and upgrade our public services. Privatization often begins to look good when government determines that it cannot afford to keep providing services. In fact, some of our current government leaders are or have actively pursued privatization in this state. In 1999, the then Senator Norm Coleman launched a water privatization campaign titled Complete St. Paul. An alliance of labor and community groups responded to the privatization threat by launching their own campaign titled St. Paul Works. On September 1, the Pioneer Press published an article titled Soaked in St. Paul, and this is what they had to say. St. Paul got what Mayor Norm Coleman called a very, very preliminary sales pitch after Coleman invited the world's largest private water systems operator, United Water Services, to make a presentation in July. The invitation was probably prompted by the distribution of a pro-privatization report by the National Association of Water Companies, a well-funded association of private water operators, at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting held in New Orleans in June. Preliminary or not, Workers at the St. Paul Water Utility are extremely concerned about the prospect of this valuable and indispensable city asset being auctioned off by Coleman as part of his Complete St. Paul campaign to privatize city services and whipsaw city unions. Representatives of several water utility unions are active participants in the labor-led St. Paul Works Alliance. As members of this community labor coalition, they are seeking to alert the labor movement and the public at large to the danger of turning the utility over to a profit-taking outside operator, or even worse, selling the assets of the utility outright." End quote. The St. Paul Works campaign ended with a victory. They successfully managed to pass the Managed Competition Ordinance. This ordinance provides for protection of city workers and public services. It was a landmark success in the campaign to keep water services public. The state of Minnesota, however, needs more laws and ordinances to help defend the public right to water. Minnesota Water Alliance is currently working on 2 fronts in Minnesota. Many outlying cities are being approached by a company named Alco Ventures. Alco is offering an arrangement called lease in, lease out to cash-strapped cities needing financial resources to upgrade and or maintain their city services. Minnesota Water Alliance wants to let citizens know of what the implications are of lease in, lease out agreements. Also, we are encouraging metropolitan citizens to take a very close look at the Metropolitan Council proposal for the future of the Twin Cities. Let's begin by discussing lease-in, lease-out proposals, which I refer to as LILOs. City officials in Minnesota and South Dakota have been receiving many offers from a consortium of private investors to offer up their wastewater utility assets in exchange for upfront payments of capital. The cities of Austin, Rochester, Burnsville, Eagan, Owatonna, and Duluth have been approached by Alco to lease their water and wastewater utilities to private investors by means of this agreement called lease-back arrangement. Alco is a U.S. and Australian-based financing company specializing in leasing public assets. In a lease-back or lease-in, lease-out agreement, which we call LILOs, a city leases its water and wastewater infrastructure, including treatment plants, pipes, pumps, and land, to a private company. The leases are typically for 99 years. Then, the private investor immediately turns around and leases the water structure back to the city for a period of 30 years. The private company, in most cases, is a large bank, an insurance company, or a private investor with a substantial amount of capital. We suspect they also have long-term interest in the possible ownership of public infrastructure. There is a broker, in our case, this is Alco, and the broker is a leasing company that negotiates the agreement between the private investor and the city under the counsel of a local law firm. The private company seeks to lease the public assets in order to take tax write-offs on the depreciation of those assets. This is depreciation that the city is unable to utilize because of its nonprofit status. Once the deal closes, the city immediately receives approximately 4 to 7% of the net present value of the assets in cash. This money can be used to fund current capital improvement projects. Also, at the time the deal closes, the private investor deposits the remaining amount of the net present value into an escrow account, which is called a defeasance fund. The money in the defeasance fund is used in part to pay for the lease over the next 30 years of the lease-back agreement. More importantly, though, the defeasance fund is intended to be used to buy off the remaining 69 years of the 99-year lease at the end of the 30-year lease-back period. In the most optimistic scenario, the fund would perform well enough that there would be sufficient cash in it to pay off the underlying 99-year lease. If that occurs, the city can recover full ownership and control of the previously leased assets. Additionally, a substantial amount of legal, accounting, and transaction fees are typically funded up front at the risks of the broker. If the deal falls through, the broker absorbs these costs. But if the agreement is made, the city will be required to cover these fees using money from the defeasance fund as well. Minnesota Water Alliance has many concerns about LILO agreements. First of all, what happens at the end of the 30-year leaseback period? This is crucial, and the terms by which a municipality can and cannot buy back the remainder of the 90-year lease are critical. There are two possible outcomes. One, the money in the defeasance fund can be voluntarily kept by the city. Then the private investor that leased it takes over as owner and operator for the next 69 years to operate it as it sees fit. The second possible outcome is that the city makes the last payment, collapses the head lease, and becomes the sole owner of the public utility, just as it was before the LILO agreement was made. This second scenario assumes two very important things. One, it assumes that there is still sufficient money remaining in the defeasance fund. If there isn't, then the city will need to scramble to find the needed capital and make the payment or surrender the utility to the private investor. This possibility represents one of the largest risks to the city. The second possibility is that the original transaction has remained acceptable to the IRS. If not, and if the investor has not realized the anticipated benefits, there might be room for legal action on part of the private investor. Possible reasons for this might be that the city underperformed or lost federal tax-exempt status on outstanding bond payments and was subsequently downgraded. Another concern with LILOs is this. If the private investor is guaranteed the ability to take depreciation write-offs on existing infrastructure, then what happens to the utility during the leaseback period if the city wants to upgrade or repair the asset? Some time ago in St. Paul, a deal was struck with private investors to lease the old St. Paul Civic Center. When the facility began to fall apart, the city proposed improvements, but the investors would not allow for them. The proposed repairs were denied because performing them would have interrupted the tax write-offs that the investors were taking on depreciation of the facility. It's one thing to hold a building hostage, but it is unacceptable to place a city's water and wastewater system at risk. In an essential service like water treatment, to allow a private entity to take depreciation write-offs on assets while holding legal rights to prevent repairs is simply bad public policy. Another reason for Minnesota Water Alliance's opposition to LILO agreements is that there is a growing body of evidence that LILOs are simply a tax scheme. The IRS has found some forms of LILO agreements to be illegitimate tax havens. There are slight differences between the LILO arrangements that have been disallowed in the past and the ones that currently exist. Each arrangement has to be examined on a case-by-case basis. Leasing companies actively pursuing new LILO contracts may be hoping that Congress, which is heavily influenced by pro-leasing lobbies, will continue to drag its feet on passing new legislation that would outlaw LILO privatizations. Also, the IRS is severely understaffed and underfunded and simply cannot begin to keep pace with all the proposals that are being made. Yet another concern about LILO proposals has to do with tort liability. Municipalities currently enjoy the privilege of immunity from tort liability. Would entering into LILO agreements remove this immunity to litigation? Minnesota State Auditor Pat Awada recently raised this concern as well. Most municipalities currently enjoy immunity from tort lawsuits that can arise and would otherwise have potential for bankrupting the entity or increasing costs to pay for liability insurance. For example, in 1993, the city of Milwaukee faced massive tort liability when cryptosporidium found its way into the water system, resulting over 400,000 people getting sick, 4,400 hospitalizations, and 100 deaths. What if the city had not been able to claim some level of immunity from all the lawsuits? Many questions surround LILO agreements. Minnesota Water Alliance stands firm in its position that water services should be managed for the public good. It is from this position that we are also looking closely at the draft of the Metropolitan Council's 2030 Regional Development Framework. The Regional Development Framework is a document that seeks a vision for the future of the seven-county metropolitan region. It strives to respond to projected growth in the region. In the proposal, the following position has been taken. New housing developments will need transportation, sewer and water supply, and providing these services will require continued coordination of planning and implementation between regional and local governments. The marketplace, supplemented by public-private partnerships, is key to this effort. To us, the comment on public-private partnerships points toward an openness to private services. Given the history of Norma Coleman's campaign to privatize St. Paul's water service assets, and recent activity that include the 2030 proposal's openness to public-private partnerships, numerous LILO proposals throughout the state, and the fact that recently St. Paul was willing to consider leasing the wastewater utility to pay for a ballpark, it seems that water privatization efforts are alive and well in Minnesota. Minnesotans need to speak up now. Water must remain a public good. Water and wastewater services must remain accessible to the public. We need to set this expectation now. Water is life. Water should not be managed for profits that trump public health. If you would like to join us in our efforts to protect Minnesota's waters, please contact us at www.mnwater.org. Thank you very much.